Martin Kulldorf is a former professor of medicine at Harvard University, former emphasis, and Mass General Brigham and founding Mass General Brigham Hospital and founding fellow of the Academy for Science and Freedom. And of course, you remember we've had Martin Kulldorf on the show many times over the last several years during COVID. And he, along with Jay Bhattacharya and Sunetra Gupta and Scott Atlas and a handful of others, were the nucleus of the Great Barrington Declaration and essentially represented the side that brought appropriate scientific skepticism to the pronouncements that were coming from the government. And if you remember, and you can go back and look at the permanent record, this was not ideological from the Great Barrington Declaration folks as compared to the government. It was not anti-vax. It was measured and textured and humble. Here's what we don't know. Here's what we think. Here's how we should try to get to what we don't know. I mean, so the heroes in these stories, in the story of COVID, are the people that were the most vilified and turned out to be, of course, the most correct. And it's professionals in the space that risked their professional careers, their livelihoods, at the time, in the moment, not after they retired, not after they were collecting a pension, Francis Collins, to tell the truth because lives and livelihoods and liberties were at stake. And by the way, just as a quick aside before we get to Martin Kulldorf, because I so love this piece that Cheryl Atkinson did on her most recent edition of Full Measure. Mm-hmm. She talked to whistleblowers, and what it entails to be a whistleblower. And these epidemiologists that I just described, including the one we're going to speak to, I mean, they were effectively whistleblowers.
Right.
And we're going to talk a little bit later about a Boeing whistleblower who's no longer with us. But Lauren Reed, you may not remember her name. She was the Acorn whistleblower. She was the whistleblower who said during the Obama years, Acorn was embezzling all the millions of dollars in federal funds it had received to do, political field work for the Democrat Party. But whatever, it was illegitimately funded. But that's not the issue. The issue was they were stealing the money. They were not using the federal taxpayer dollars under the terms of the grant they received. But listen to what she says about the state of whistleblowing in America today and what it means to be a whistleblower. This is just an important cultural commentary by Lauren Reed.
What would you say is the state of whistleblowing in America today?
People are calling themselves whistleblowers that are not. There's a simple rule for whistleblowing. You blew the whistle when something was at stake. That is when you blow the whistle. Not after your 401 is secure, your job is secure, and your kid has been accepted to whatever school you've slotted for them. Because it doesn't make what you're saying less true, but it does not make you a whistleblower.
And what is the sort of a takeaway message or the thing that you would want people to know about the whole idea of whistleblowing?
So people think that the defenders of democracy wear uniforms. That's absolutely true. But the ultimate defenders of democracy are those who are willing to tell the truth and withstand the cost. And there is no such thing as telling the truth and paying no cost.
There's no such thing as telling the truth and paying no cost. Love that. Martin Kulldorf, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote this piece recently in the City Journal about your travails over the last 4 years, starting with the fact that you're a former professor of medicine at Harvard. So tell us what happened.
Well, they were not very happy when I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford and Sunetra Gupta at Oxford. But then eventually the disagreement was about infection-acquired immunity. We have known for 2,500 years since the Athenian plague in 430, if you have recovered from a disease, an infectious disease, then you have immunity. And somehow during the pandemic, that was questioned. There was a memorandum in the Lancet, which used to be a leading medical journal, where Harvard professors and others questioning the COVID-acquired immunity. So they had these mandates on the vaccines, even for people who didn't need it, who had superior immunity. And I argue that hospitals should hire nurses and others with prior immunity, because they are the least likely to sort of infect others. But instead, they were firing people with who had, like, they fired nurses who had taken care of COVID patients during 2020, and then they got sick in COVID. They were home for a while and they got back. And then the bureaucrats, the hospital bureaucrats, they fired them because they hadn't gotten the vaccine, even though they already had better immunity. And I never took care of COVID patients, but I was one of the people fired. And many professors got exemptions, but I requested exemptions, but did not get it, even though I had an immune deficiency, genetic immune deficiency called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency.
So you were fired for not getting vaxxed?
Yes, and they could have kept me if they wanted to, but they didn't want me there. They could have also hired me afterwards, hired me back, but they explicitly said I didn't want to do that.
Well, yeah, isn't that interesting, right? Because Lloyd Austin won't hire people in the armed services that he fired. He won't hire them back. There's actually a lawsuit that's been filed, religious discrimination lawsuit that's been filed by a Hollywood actor that could be precedential in terms of the major studios. But it's the same thing. They don't want you back because to take you back would be to. I think in their
admitting that they were wrong, right?
Well, I think in their minds that's what it would be, and it also sends a message that if you disobey us, that there is a path back, and we want the message to be you cannot disobey us.
Yeah.
Well, have you thought about suing Harvard?
Well, I'm not that kind of person who sort of. I prefer to sort of just tell people what happened, and then fight for freedom of speech and academic freedom. So maybe I will, maybe I won't, but that's not on the top of my agenda.
Well, this article, I love this article. Harvard Tramples the Truth. It's at cityjournal.org. But in the article, you talked about how the harm that was done is going to last for decades. And just, can you walk us through that?
Well, the lockdowns and school closures, that went against all the basic principles of public health. And one of those is that you can't just focus on one disease, COVID. So we have the lockdowns create a lot of collateral public health damage for cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental health, and so on. So, and of course, education. And that's something we're going to live with for a long time now. We know that the test scores for children has gone down in the U.S., unlike Sweden that didn't lock down the schools. So that's something we live with forever, because education is important. It's important for children to go to school, and it's not just the test scores, it's also their social development. So this is something that we now have to deal with decades. Same with cancer. There were less cancer screening and less cancer treatment. So somebody who will not die maybe 2 or 3 years from now instead of living another 10, 15 years, because getting your medical treatment for cancer is important. If you don't get it, then you won't live as long. So, and that's just cancer. There's so many other parts of medicine. So these lockdowns were enormously damaging on public health in general, and of course as well on education and the economy.
And just recalling the media is folding in with the COVIDian state edicts. At the time, you wrote op-eds about Sweden and what Sweden was doing when it came to K through 12 schools and not shutting them down. and you couldn't get published anywhere. You couldn't get published, at least not in the English-speaking world, right?
Yeah, so I had op-eds in Sweden, the mainly newspapers there. I'm a native of Sweden, defending the Swedish strategy. But in the U.S., I was not able to publish anything in the spring or summer of 2020, except in August I was finally able to publish an op-ed in against the school closure, CNN, but that was seen in Espanol. I know how to write Spanish. CNN in English didn't want to publish it.
That is so weird. And not one person in Sweden ages 1 to 15 died from COVID.
Yeah, so they kept the schools and daycare open for among 1.8 million children that spring. Not a single child died, and there was only a few hospitalizations. And the teachers were at no higher risk than other professions. So we knew that early in the summer of 2020. But then New England Journal of Medicine published a paper by a couple of Harvard professors discussing school closures, and I didn't even mention Sweden and the positive results there. So that's like doing a trial of a new drug, and then you don't even have a placebo control group to compare with. That's not how you find the truth.
Another example about how so much of this was an exercise in the compulsory unification of opinion, to borrow from Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. Your experience on the COVID vaccine working group and how you were bounced from that working group. This is the CDC's COVID vaccine working group, if I'm recalling correctly. You were bounced from that working group because you were too pro-vaccine.
Yes, I'm probably the only one who's been fired by CDC for being too pro-vaccine. But they took so there were the two mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and then there was a third one, Johnson and Johnson, but it's not an mRNA vaccine. And there were some reports of blood clots in young women. So CDC decided to take a pause on it, and that was reasonable for young women, but not for older people where there had been no such reports, and they're the one who really needed it because it's the older people who were dying from COVID. So I objected to the pause of this for older people because it was a non-mRNA vaccine that was only one dose, so it was important for reaching, for example, hard-to-reach people like in rural areas or like homeless people. But they did not like that I argued against the official CDC position, so they fired me from the committee. But 4 days later, they actually implemented what I suggested. So that's effective, but I was removed from the CDC committee for that. I'm fired.
Mm-hmm. Removed from the CDC working group for being too pro-vaccine. Right. It's all about the unification of opinion. Yeah. The other thing I wanted you to discuss from your background as an epidemiologist is why you argue that the trials for the vaccines were improperly or poorly designed.
So they were randomized, which is important for all drug and vaccine trials, but they didn't have the right outcome. So they looked at symptomatic COVID disease and showed that there was 95% efficacy for short-term symptomatic infections. But that's not what we care about. Our concern is not that somebody will be home for a few days in bed sick. We're concerned about people not dying or being hospitalized. And they didn't design it for that because they recruited young and middle-aged adults who mostly survive whether they have the placebo or the vaccine. So they should have recruited more people in the 70s and 80s and 90s in order to determine if this actually reduces mortality. And they didn't do that. And then they ended the trials very early instead of continuing them to look at long-term efficacy and side effects. So these were not well-designed trials for giving us the information we need about these vaccines. And, of course, the boosters even worse because they didn't even have randomized trials.
Your colleague, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, says that the next virus, they'll absolutely do a lockdown again. Do you they being the COVIDians who locked down America. Do you agree with him that that's their attitude?
I think that they're going to try to do that, but unlike 4 years ago, there is now a very strong organized opposition against it. So 4 years, there were a lot of people speaking out, but they couldn't get heard. They were silenced, and everybody was sort of on their own. But now there's an organized effort that ended these lockdowns. They would have continued longer if there wasn't. And I think next time around, that's already sort of an established. People are already on the ball about this thing. So I don't think they will succeed if they try again.
He is Martin Kulldorf, former professor of medicine at Harvard and Mass General Brigham Hospital, founding fellow of the Academy for Science and Freedom. Professor Kulldorf, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Yep, always a pleasure. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today. TV news. It's a love-hate relationship. Well, let's be honest, more hate. We agree. That's why we're different. Salem News Channel has assembled the greatest collection of conservative minds all in one place. Home to Charlie Kirk, Hugh Hewitt, Eric Metaxas, and more. There's finally a place on TV for lovers of freedom like you. Watch anytime, on any screen, free 24/7. Find what you're looking for at snc.tv. That's snc.tv. AM 560, The Answer.
I really love this article. We should tweet it out. It's fascinating. All right, coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.